Well, it's an honor and a privilege to be with all of you today. I was sitting here thinking when I sat down in this room, this was where I taught for 15 years in this very room. So this brings back many fond memories for me. Fortunately for you, I have very little statistics planned for the agenda today. I saw a few people standing up to walk out. Come on back. I'm just thrilled to be with you today. I want to point out that you may see two microphones here. I've often wondered, I asked someone one time, why do we use these cheek mics instead of lapel mics? It seems like those lapel mics are just as effective. And they said, well, it's because the lapel mics are too visually obvious. I don't know if you noticed, but it's a little obvious that there's a little thing dangling from my cheek. I'll still bring this up with our IT staff because I'm a little confused, I got to admit. But excuse me for my voice. I was yelling at a recent sporting event, and I seem to have lost my voice. So I may take a couple of drinks as we go along here today. I wanted to spend a little time talking first about the Sorensen Center and just a little bit of a history about the Sorensen Center I think will be valuable for all of you, a little bit about its mission and its intended purpose, and then I want to talk a little bit about the theme. I think the theme is remarkable. It's so closely tied to some things that I've been thinking about, Jeff. So I'm so grateful for your invitation. One of the things that I assume most in this audience know, but I thought it worth pointing out, at Brigham Young University, we have a remarkable governance. It is something that is remarkable not only based on its composition, but on its expertise as well. I was recently at a convening of college higher education presidents, and we were talking about the merits of faith-based institutions versus secular institutions. It was an amazing discussion. And someone who apparently is not a big fan of what we do here at BYU said, the real reason why BYU is successful is because of its governance. That's the only thing that really drives it. And I sat there and thought, that might actually be right. You were trying to lob a criticism, but that might actually be right. For those of you that don't know, our board of trustees is made up of 3 officers of the board. Those officers are our chairman, President Russell M. Nelson, our first vice chairman, President Dallin H. Oaks, and our second vice chairman, President Henry B. Eyring. That is a remarkable board of trustees that gives us inspired guidance that reflects the hand of the Lord in so many of our day-to-day activities. It is with that context that I wanted to share some of the founding details of the Sorensen Center. The Sorensen Center was established while I was the academic vice president. And I remember that there was some discussions about David and Verla Sorensen and what remarkable individuals they are and how they wanted to bless the lives of Brigham Young University students. It was a remarkable discussion, and we started talking about what were the ways that the legacy of David and Verla Sorensen could extend on this campus. And candidly, we don't establish centers very often at this university. It's a reserved word. Most universities, centers pop up every other day. But it's something that we don't take lightly. And so when we started having discussions with this inspired, generous family about how we might honor the legacy of David and Verla Sorensen, this idea of ethical leadership in business was one that had a lot of resonance. It's something where we as Brigham Young University have a strong and storied tradition as a university. And as we went to the Board of Trustees, which is part of our practice, we have a whole set of guidelines and documents that talk about the issues that we take to our Board of Trustees. And we talked about the establishment of the Sorensen Center. We had talked about this idea of ethics. And as we took this to our Board of Trustees, our inspired Board of Trustees, as is always the case, our thinking was enhanced by the Lord's mouthpiece on the earth at this time. Because our idea of ethical leadership was enhanced by the addition of the word moral. That is a remarkable moment for the establishment of the Sorensen Center for Moral and Ethical Leadership. You see, in today's society, morality, its tenets, its practice, its execution is ignored and, in fact, at times shunned by the world. So the world needs the Sorensen Center for Moral and Ethical Leadership. It needs more moral and ethical leaders. It needs the graduates of Brigham Young University and how they've been enhanced by participation in the Sorensen Center for Moral and Ethical Leadership. I'm grateful for Jeff and his leadership team for continuing to strive to anchor the efforts of the Sorensen Center on moral and ethical leadership principles. In the coming days, it will be ever more important and even more important than it has been in the previous 3 years to anchor the efforts on the Sorensen Center's work on moral and ethical leadership. There will be tendencies, there will be temptations, and there will be diversions for the Sorensen Center. The reason this is needed today, perhaps more than ever, is perhaps best illustrated by a Harvard study recently convened. Even it was convened this year, where young adults around the country were surveyed, and they were asked the question, are you feeling a complete lack of purpose? And so I asked myself, what is the percentage going to look like? And it turns out that a nearly 60% of young adults say they lack all purpose whatsoever in their lives. That purpose can be greatly strengthened by the mission of the Sorensen Center for Moral and Ethical Leadership. This is an alarming statistic. Our amazing friend, Rabbi Ari Berman, the president of Yeshiva University, was on this campus and gave an incredible forum where he said people are talking all the time about a crisis of faith. But what he said they're really suffering from is not a crisis of faith. They're suffering from a crisis of meaning. And when we build moral and ethical leaders among our students, we help to insert that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose. And I contend that we need that today more than ever. We need that anchoring influence of a moral compass. Today, I have 4 main messages that I want to share with you today, and we'll see if my presentation works. My 4 main messages are as follows. It says it's supposed to go. Oh, it's going. There it goes. Except it's now going way too fast. Sorry about that. My 4 main messages I want to talk about today are centered on this idea of becoming and its connection to covenants. I submit to you, and I hope to demonstrate today, that becoming is accelerated by our covenants. And by covenants, I mean moral commitments. I'll talk about different kinds of covenants today. The second message that I want to share with you today is that covenants cultivate relationships. I want to share some of what an amazing, talented rabbi has shared on this very topic. The third point that I want to share is that covenants help bind us individually to Jesus Christ. Prophets, seers, and revelators have talked extensively on this topic, and I want to reinforce some of what they've shared. And finally, I want to tie this directly to the theme of this conference and our efforts today, and that's that the covenants require us to serve God's children, to serve them one by one. So to start off with, I want to talk about being accelerated by covenants. President Nelson, in what might very well be the most seminal talk of his entire ministry as our prophet, gave a talk called The Everlasting Covenant. Now you might say, I don't remember hearing that talk in conference. And the reason is, he didn't give this talk in conference. He gave it at a leadership session for the leadership of the church. And it was so remarkable that it was republished as a separate talk in October of 2022. I highly recommend this talk to all of you. In this talk, this remarkable talk, which if you pay close attention, is quoted by nearly every other member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles in repeated addresses during General Conference year after year. In this talk, President Nelson said this about covenants. Once we make a covenant with God, we leave neutral ground forever. He then goes on to say, God will not abandon his relationship with those who have forged such a bond with him. In fact, all those who have made a covenant with God have access to a special kind of love and mercy. In the Hebrew language, that covenantal love is called chesed. Close quote. You see, President Nelson understands the depth of our covenants and how those can help us become a disciple of Jesus Christ, how they can help us become precisely the kind of leader that has a moral and ethical commitment. These covenants are deeply meaningful. These covenants are the accelerator of our becoming more like our Savior Jesus Christ. They demand that we have eyes to see not only others, but ourselves as we might become, and not limited by what we are today. It is a remarkable thing to make and keep sacred covenants and how they can accelerate our process of becoming. I want to share an experience about one of our faculty at BYU. By the way, I was recently giving a talk at a stake center in Bountiful. And when I was giving that talk, someone sent me an email and said that they found my talk off-putting because all I spoke about was BYU. And I thought, well, I don't know what you expected when you invited the president of BYU to speak at this event. So of course my story is going to start about one of our faculty members. See, we have a faculty member who's a law school faculty member. I've now only limited that to 40 people. That's as far as I'm going to get in naming this person. And this faculty member saw a student who was admitted candidly on a bit of a provisional basis. This student knew that, this faculty member knew that, and candidly, this student was trumpeting this fact to the rest of his classmates. So his classmates knew it. He didn't see himself as qualified to be a member of our law school class that he was admitted for. But this faculty member, because he'd made covenants with God, was able to see this student for what they might become. This faculty member met with this student on a near daily basis to work through this student's papers, to work through this student's preparation for exams. And when it came time for the bar, this faculty member continued to meet with this student on a daily basis so that he might help prepare this student. Now, this student today stands as a member of the Utah State Bar, practicing as an attorney for one of the most prominent law schools in the state of Utah, law practices in the state of Utah. It is that kind of commitment to seeing others as they can become, not as they are today or even as they see themselves, that signifies a disciple of Jesus Christ and is about the topic that you're speaking during this conference. So thank you, Jeff, for putting together that theme. Secondly, I want to talk about covenants as they relate to relationships. Now, a bit of background on this quote. This quote is by Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi for the United Kingdom. He is a remarkable human being, and he wrote a remarkable book, which, by the way, should be required reading for anyone who comes in contact with the Sorensen Center for Moral and Ethical Leadership. This book's title is Morality. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend it. In this book, the rabbi talks in depth about covenants, and candidly, it's a different understanding of covenants than we think about. You see, we think about covenants as an agreement between us and God, where God sets the terms of the contract, the covenant. Rabbi talks a little bit more about a covenant between two individuals. And I want to share with you this quote. It's one of my favorites. He said, self-interest generates contracts. In a contract, two or more individuals, each pursuing their own advantage, come together to make an exchange for mutual benefit. I pay my garage mechanic to mend my car. I and others pay our taxes to ensure that we have the social services we need. So there is the commercial contract that creates the market and the social contract that creates the state. But in both cases, the motivating factor is self-interest. Contracts are about I. A covenant generates a different kind of relationship altogether. He then goes on to talk about covenants, and he says, recall that what makes it, and he's talking about covenants, different is that in a covenant, two or more individuals, each respecting the dignity and integrity of the other, come together in a bond of love and trust to share their interests, sometimes to even to share their lives by pledging their faithfulness to one another, to do together what neither can achieve alone. Unlike contracts which are entered into for the sake of advantage, covenants are moral commitments sustained by loyalty and fidelity, even when they call for sacrifice. They are about you and I coming together to form a we. That is a remarkable description of covenants. And when it's framed in terms of the covenants we make with God, it carries an even greater weight and depth and profundity. I'm grateful for Rabbi Sacks and for his definition. I want to talk a little bit about how this happens in a one-by-one way, but institution by institution, because I think sometimes the one is individual people, and sometimes the one is individual organizations. And I'm going to talk about it in a frame that might seem a little strange, especially after last Saturday night's football game. I want to talk about an effort that has been initiated within our athletics department, connected to our alumni association, which is also connected to the church humanitarian arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You might say, I can't see how those three organizations have that much in common. But it turns out that football games have provided just such a marriage. You see, we have started as an institution, when we entered the Big 12, we decided that we wanted to do something different, something that distinguished us from the rest of the athletic organizations in the Big 12. We wanted to take the idea of a rivalry, the idea of a football game, which carries with it a lot of contention, a lot of toxicity, and we wanted to bring love and the idea of how covenants can bind us to one another. And so it started with our tailgates. You see, we have tailgates at BYU football games, although our tailgates look a little different than other schools' tailgates. Our tailgates involve a service project that is not imagined by BYU community members, because that's at times offensive that we would walk into a community and say, we know how to fix your problems. Instead, we work with the local community to identify problems that they see. And what we bring is resources like our energy and our enthusiasm and our love. And that's where the church humanitarian arm came in, where they said, well, if you'll do that and your alumni will bring food and mattresses and books to these communities, we'll send truckloads of food and mattresses and books to accompany your efforts, to double your efforts. And so it's an amazing thing to be at one of these tailgates and to see the truck, which is the BYU football truck carrying all of our equipment, followed by a Deseret Industries truck that's full of food for the local food pantry. And to watch the looks on people's faces as they see the amazing love and energy of the community of BYU fans. It's an amazing thing. And you combine that with our big stories. BYU TV has started to develop as part of every football game, not just our away football game, but a piece that features some of the amazing things going on by their alumni. Not the BYU alumni, but the alumni of the school we play. Featuring someone who has let the light of Christ shine in their life. It's been an amazing thing. I walked into the box of the president of the University of Oklahoma, and he came running down the stairs of the box and embraced me. And he said, "We love BYU. We love what they've done for our community." He tweeted it out to the entire alumni base of the University of Oklahoma. It's now the most watched BYU Big Stories with over 1 million views. It's an amazing thing to see this happen. And all of this because we feel like we have to have the courage to be different, to let our sense of covenants come out in what we do. This was probably most remarkable in a letter I received from the West Virginia University president. Not president, I apologize. The chair of the faculty senate at West Virginia University. Now, for those of you that haven't spent a lot of time in higher education, I need to explain a little bit about faculty senate chairs. Faculty senates are places where, excuse me, faculty for saying this, but the grousiest of faculty gather because they've got an axe to grind with the university. And the chair of the faculty senate is usually the grousiest among them. So you will find this as remarkable, I suspect, as I did. When I received this unsolicited letter from the chair of the faculty senate at West Virginia University, she said, "Dear President Reese, we all love a good rivalry. And this is why as Mountaineers, we have the dubious habit of booing when the opposing football team runs out of the tunnel, down the sideline. But last Saturday evening, we found ourselves questioning that practice as one of the most classy gestures ever to unfold at our stadium occurred when the Cougars emerged from the tunnel carrying a West Virginia state flag. I was already developing an appreciation for BYU's upcoming visit when I read about the book drive, a partnership that was in part carried out with my college, which houses a school of education and the West Virginia University Nursery School. Then I saw the flag, but that wasn't the end. Yesterday, our university media issued a newsletter with a link to the BYU TV's webpage about BYU, about West Virginia University. I was astounded. The Big 12 is lucky to have BYU in its family, and we'll look forward to having the Cougars back in town. Thank you for bringing loving energy to Morgantown and for reminding us all that, as the BYU TV page states, football is indeed more than just a game. Those are the kinds of barriers that get broken down, the way hearts can be changed when we become covenant keepers. Covenants also help bind us to Jesus Christ. In this remarkable talk from President Nelson, he goes on to say near the end of this talk that the covenant path is a path of love. That incredible hesed, that compassionate caring for and reaching out to each other. The greatest joy you will ever experience is when you are consumed with love for God and for all his children. Loving God more than anyone or anything else is the condition that brings true peace, comfort, confidence, and joy. The covenant path is all about our relationship with God, our hesed relationship with him. When we enter a covenant with God, we have made a covenant with him who will always keep his word. He will do everything he can without infringing on our agency to help us keep ours, close quote. You see, it is true. It is exactly as Elder Kieran taught. God is in relentless pursuit of us. Elder David A. Bednar taught further about how these covenants bind us to Jesus Christ and therefore to make us more Christ-like leaders. He taught 4 different ways. And as a reminder, he said, covenants help us to know first who we really are, what our identity is. And if we see others as children of God, it fundamentally changes how we treat one another. 2, covenants bring us closer to the Savior, in part because as we make and keep those sacred covenants, they make us more like the Savior, which brings us closer to him and develop tighter bonds and relationships with the Savior. 3, covenants help us take his yoke upon us. And when we do so, we see others through different eyes. These covenants help transform our secular selves into divine people, more like our Savior Jesus Christ as we take his yoke upon us. And 4th, covenants help remind us that we are never alone. One of the great promises of the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ is that he will make all that is unfair in this life right. And part of that unfairness is the aloneness, this loneliness epidemic that is facing this generation, perhaps more than any other generation that has ever been on the face of the earth. So covenant keeping is also a key to our never feeling alone. With this loneliness epidemic, we need covenants more than we ever have. And lastly, covenants require us to serve God's children one by one. Elder Christofferson, in a remarkable talk titled The Doctrine of Belonging, said, the doctrine of belonging has to do with our own contributions. Although we rarely think about it, much of our belonging comes from our service and the sacrifices we make for others and for the Lord. Excessive focus on our personal needs or on our own comfort can frustrate that sense of belonging. This is a key to our sense of developing an attitude of service. I love a book by Angela Duckworth called Grit. In there, Angela Duckworth defines grit as this special combination of perseverance and passion. And that's what makes incredible leaders. Leaders who exhibit grit. And for paragons of grit, that's her terminology, not mine. I want to make sure we give credit where credit's due. For paragons of grit, the long days and evenings of toil, and there are those for the paragons of grit and for those striving to be moral and ethical leaders, the setbacks and disappointments which are inevitable, the struggles and the sacrifice, all of this is worth it because ultimately their efforts pay dividends for other people. For paragons of grit, a requirement of those striving to keep their covenants, it is because you see the dividends paid to others. I love that thought. For as we pursue education in any way, shape, or form, whether you be students at BYU, whether it be your lifelong learning, it has to be not for personal gratification, but because you see an opportunity to serve others. And if you'll permit me, I think my time's almost done, but if you'll permit me one last example, I want to talk for a moment, quite personally, about the person in my life who is perhaps the best example of this, having a sense of how her efforts can serve others, and that's my mom. You see, my mom wasn't able to graduate from college, and she's always had to work really hard in her job to just make ends meet. It was a little rough, and luckily she worked her way to where she experienced enough success that she can provide for herself. And my mom got a calling about 10 years ago. And her calling was as a public affairs specialist in the stake. And candidly, she was getting to that age where she felt like she was being put out to pasture when she got that call. And her first assignment was to serve as the liaison from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from her stake to Catholic Charities. And she went and met with Catholic Charities and found great admiration in the work being done by Catholic Charities, but she sort of felt like this was going to be an assignment to go to a monthly meeting with donuts every Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. And so she went faithfully, having made a commitment and a willingness to accept this calling to serve in this capacity. What she didn't know is that something was about to happen with Catholic Charities that would change the course of her life for the next 10 years. You see, there was, at that time, a big group of refugees that were sent to Albuquerque, New Mexico, from Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania, and Burundi. All Swahili speakers. And she became entranced with their plight. And she dug in and started helping these refugees. And spent hours and hours and hours each week. I asked her one time, what was your weekly total this week spent with the refugees from these countries, these Swahili speakers? And she said she was spending between 50 and 60 hours a week for the last 2 years. And it turns out that she developed some incredible relationships with some of these people. The efforts that she was involved in looked like setting up apartments with basic furnishings and some food when they were arrived in Albuquerque, arranging with the landlords to provide this at a rate that would be commensurate with the monies that were able to be filtered into this issue. And it turns out that as she developed these relationships, there were a few that started asking her about her religious beliefs. And it turns out that she had kind of some strict instructions that she wasn't to be a missionary. She wasn't to be sharing the gospel with these folks. That wasn't her role. So as she started to share this, a few started asking questions. And then a couple of them decided that they wanted to schedule a time to meet with some missionaries. And then a couple more decided they wanted to meet with missionaries. And then a couple more decided they wanted to have some discussions with missionaries with their families. And today, my mom serves as the Relief Society president for a Swahili-speaking branch in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with 60 members in their number. And as a Relief Society president, I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little emotional on this one. My mom has made that kind of commitment to these individuals. You see, it's not just a weekly meeting where she runs a Relief Society meeting that she is engaged with. I asked her to share a few things that she's done in the last 2 weeks. One of them's kind of funny, so I'm going to have to tell that one so I stop crying. You see, one of the families indicated that they really enjoyed grilling. That was more like the cooking that they enjoyed at home. So the ward members got together and combined their funds in my mom's home ward, not the ward where she's serving now, combined their funds and bought this family a barbecue grill. They were so grateful that this was something that would change their cooking. It would be far more like the cooking they'd done at home. They failed to tell this family was that the grill was meant for the outside. See, this family was cooking it indoors, and they were shortly thereafter evicted from their apartment. And that leads me to the part that's probably going to get me more emotional. See, my mom's work as a Relief Society president is far more than just going to Relief Society meetings. She spends hours each week meeting with school guidance counselors because these students are bullied in class because they don't speak very good English. My mom spends hours each week providing meals and housing and furniture because these individuals aren't familiar with the customs and traditions in the United States, and they often do get evicted. My mom spends most weekends at weddings and helping with families who have recently experienced childbirth. My mom is an amazing example to me of one who understands the doctrine of belonging and the covenants that she's made in the temple in consecrating her life for people who she loves. Now, brothers and sisters, I'm grateful for the lives that you lead. I'm grateful for your willingness to come to a conference that talks about moral and ethical leadership. I contend that we need moral and ethical leaders more than we ever have in previous history in the history of the world. I believe that becoming is accelerated by covenants. As you become moral and ethical leaderships, a key component, in fact, I would argue a necessary component, is the covenants you make with one another, with your fellow human beings, and perhaps most importantly, with your God. I believe that covenants are all about relationships with one another and relationships with God. Covenants help bind us to Jesus Christ. If we turn our lives over to Jesus Christ, He will make more of our efforts than we can of ourselves. That is the promise of the enabling power of the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And finally, covenants require us to serve God's children one by one.